They called it blue gold. In the gray world of Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe, a pair of authentic Levi's jeans could be worth more than a month's salary for a factory worker. Treasured like jewels, displayed like trophies, used as currency. While Soviet leaders preached about the evils of decadent Western capitalism, millions of their citizens dreamed of a piece of blue denim with reinforced copper-riveted seams and a small red label. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. It was 1974, and a young Hungarian woman named Katalin stood nervously at the Austrian border, her heart pounding in her chest. Hidden in her luggage was contraband that could land her in serious trouble. 3 pairs of American Levi's 501 jeans. Not drugs, not weapons, not political manifestos, just pants. Yet, in the complex geopolitical landscape of the Cold War, these denim trousers represented something far more dangerous to communist authorities: the irresistible allure of Western freedom and prosperity. The story of how blue jeans infiltrated the Iron Curtain is not just about fashion. It's about how a simple garment became a powerful symbol of resistance, desire, and cultural rebellion during one of history's most tense ideological standoffs. It reveals how the soft power of American consumer goods accomplished what political rhetoric and military posturing could not, winning the hearts and minds of ordinary people behind the Iron Curtain. The Cold War was conventionally fought with nuclear threats, proxy conflicts, and espionage. But there was another battleground altogether: culture. And in this theater of war, weapons took unexpected forms: rock music, Coca-Cola, Hollywood films, and perhaps most surprisingly effective of all, blue jeans. The humble denim trouser, born in the American West during the Gold Rush, would become an improbable instrument of Western influence and a coveted symbol of everything the Soviet system failed to provide. In Moscow, 1975, a Soviet university student named Mikhail traded his father's prized war medals for a pair of smuggled Levi's. In East Berlin, a young mechanic worked overtime for 6 months to save enough for the black market price of American denim. In Prague, people would approach Western tourists on the street with a single question: jeans? You sell jeans? By the late 1970s, the obsession had reached such proportions that Soviet authorities began to speak of denim disease infecting their youth. How did a simple pair of pants become such a powerful symbol? The answer lies at the intersection of Cold War politics, consumer desire, cultural identity, and the power of forbidden fruit. It begins with understanding the gray reality of life on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, where consumer choice was limited, quality goods were scarce, and Western products took on an almost mythical status. Daily life in the Eastern Bloc during the 1970s was characterized by scarcity. The command economies of Soviet satellite states produced what central planners dictated, not what consumers desired. Store shelves were often bare. When goods did appear, people formed long queues regardless of what was being sold. The joke went that if you saw a line, you got in it first and asked what was being sold later. Quality was inconsistent, styles were utilitarian, and variety was virtually non-existent. In this environment, consumer goods from the West became powerful symbols of everything the communist system lacked. As Harvard historian Georgy Piteri noted in his studies of Cold War cultural exchange, material objects became loaded with political meaning that far exceeded their practical utility. Nothing embodied this phenomenon better than Levi's blue jeans. What made jeans so special? Unlike other Western goods, jeans were uniquely visible. They weren't consumed in private like food or alcohol. They weren't hidden away like contraband literature. They were worn publicly, a walking advertisement for Western consumer culture. Their distinctive appearance made them instantly recognizable: the indigo dye, the copper rivets, the leather patch, and especially the red tab with Levi's stitched in white. Each authentic detail mattered enormously. Jeans also carried potent cultural associations. They were the uniform of American rebels like James Dean and Marlon Brando, of rock musicians and protest movements. In a society where conformity was enforced, jeans represented individuality. In a system based on collectivism, they symbolized personal choice. They were simultaneously practical and rebellious, comfortable and provocative. The scarcity of authentic Western jeans in Eastern Europe was by design. Soviet authorities understood the symbolic power of Western consumer goods and established strict import restrictions. Official propaganda dismissed jeans as inappropriate attire associated with hooliganism and Western moral decay. The Soviet newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda described jeans-wearing youth as contaminated with the poisons of bourgeois ideology. State-run factories in countries like East Germany, Poland, and the USSR attempted to produce their own denim products to satisfy demand. But these domestic versions failed spectacularly to capture the appeal of the originals. They used inferior denim that didn't fade properly. They lacked the right cut, the distinctive stitching, and most importantly, the authentic labels. As one Polish joke from the era went, "Why are Eastern Bloc jeans like the Soviet-Afghan War? Because both involve poor material, badly executed." This gap between demand and legitimate supply created perfect conditions for a thriving black market. By the mid-1970s, a complex underground economy had developed around Western jeans. The routes by which Levi's and other Western brands entered Eastern Europe were diverse and ingenious. Foreign tourists were prime targets. Western visitors to cities like Prague, Budapest, Warsaw, and East Berlin would often be approached on the street with offers to buy the jeans they were wearing, sometimes literally off their legs. American student David Freeman, visiting Prague in 1977, recalled, "I was wearing a pair of Levi's 501s, and within 20 minutes of arriving in Wenceslas Square, I'd been offered the equivalent of a week's salary for them. When I refused, the guy pointed to a nearby public restroom and suggested I change there, assuring me he had a replacement pair of pants for me." Sailors and airline personnel who traveled regularly between East and West became important conduits. A single ship docking in Gdansk or Constanta might carry dozens of pairs of jeans hidden in crew quarters. Flight attendants on routes between Western Europe and Eastern capitals supplemented their incomes by filling their luggage with denim destined for the black market. Diplomats and their families also participated in this underground economy. Protected by diplomatic immunity, they could bring Western goods across borders with less scrutiny. Many found that selling jeans and other coveted items on the side could significantly enhance their standard of living in otherwise expensive postings. The most sophisticated operations involved professional smugglers who developed elaborate systems for moving jeans across borders. Some modified vehicles with hidden compartments, others bribed border guards. The Polish border with Sweden across the Baltic Sea was particularly porous, with fishing vessels moonlighting as smuggling operations. By the late 1970s, an estimated 1.5 million pairs of jeans were entering Poland alone each year through unofficial channels. Once inside Eastern Bloc countries, jeans entered complex distribution networks. Bartsovchiki in the Soviet Union and their equivalents throughout Eastern Europe, black marketeers specializing in Western goods, connected suppliers with eager customers. Transactions often took place in semi-public locations, certain sections of parks, specific cafes, university dormitories, and near international hotels frequented by Westerners. The value of jeans varied by country, brand, and time period, but their worth was consistently extraordinary. In the Soviet Union of the late 1970s, authentic Levi's could fetch 200 rubles on the black market, when the average monthly salary was around 150 rubles. In East Germany, Levi's might cost 400 East German marks when a typical worker earned 500, 800 marks per month. Jeans became a form of alternative currency. Polish journalist Konstanty Gebert recalled, You could bribe officials with jeans. You could pay for services. I knew a dentist who accepted one pair of Levi's for a root canal. No questions asked. No waiting list. In Czechoslovakia, a pair of Western jeans could secure preferential treatment for university housing or jump the years-long waiting list for a Škoda automobile. The extreme value placed on authentic jeans led to an ecosystem of authentication expertise. Buyers became incredibly skilled at spotting fakes. They checked stitching patterns, examined rivets, scrutinized labels, and even developed tests for fabric quality. One common verification method involved rubbing the denim vigorously. Authentic Levi's would leave a blue tinge on the skin due to their indigo dye process, while knockoffs wouldn't. The Soviet authorities' response to the jeans phenomenon evolved over time. Initial attempts at outright prohibition proved futile and possibly counterproductive, enhancing jeans' forbidden appeal. By the mid-1970s, most Eastern Bloc countries had shifted to a strategy of tolerance combined with attempts to satisfy demand through domestic production. In East Germany, the Kombinat Bekleidung Berlin began producing boxer jeans. Romania had its Polar brand. Hungary manufactured Trapper jeans. The Soviet Union created Stern jeans. None achieved the status of Western brands, but they did help normalize denim as acceptable attire rather than bourgeois provocation. Some Soviet bloc countries even arranged limited official imports of Western jeans. Hungary, pursuing its goulash communism of moderate economic liberalization, allowed selected Western goods into state-run hard currency shops. Poland permitted Puex stores to sell authentic Western products for hard currency or special certificates. But prices in these official channels remained prohibitively high for average citizens, ensuring the black market continued to thrive. By 1979, the cultural battle over jeans had reached a symbolic turning point. That year, Levi Strauss & Company made history by striking a deal with the Soviet Union to supply 25,000 pairs of jeans officially, a small number relative to demand, but a massive ideological concession. Soviet state newspaper Izvestia announced the deal with the understated headline, "Jeans Business Contract Concluded." The significance of this agreement wasn't lost on observers on either side of the Iron Curtain. As Time magazine noted, if Coca-Cola was the drink of capitalism and rock music its sound, then blue jeans were surely its uniform. Now that uniform was being officially imported into the heart of the communist world. The jeans phenomenon reveals important truths about how the Cold War was actually fought and ultimately won. While military strategists focused on nuclear arsenals and conventional forces, ordinary citizens behind the Iron Curtain were increasingly making daily choices that demonstrated their preference for Western consumer culture over Soviet alternatives. The Romanian writer Andrei Codrescu, who emigrated to the United States in 1966, later observed, "The fall of communism was not caused by Reagan's military buildup or Gorbachev's reforms. It collapsed because East Germans wanted Levi's. They wanted rock music. They wanted to live like they imagined Americans lived." This perspective aligns with what scholars now call the soft power theory of Cold War victory. The idea that Western cultural appeal, economic prosperity, and consumer choice proved more compelling to ordinary people than communist ideology. Blue jeans were the perfect embodiment of this soft power, desirable, visible, and loaded with cultural meaning. For young people especially, jeans represented more than just fashion. They were a declaration of values and aspirations. Wearing Western jeans meant identifying with a different vision of society than the one offered by official ideology. It was a small but meaningful act of everyday resistance, what Czech playwright and later president Václav Havel called living in truth, making personal choices that rejected the artificial reality constructed by the state. As the 1970s progressed into the early 1980s, the jeans phenomenon spread even further throughout Eastern Europe. In Poland, the rise of the Solidarity movement coincided with increasing Western cultural influence, including the ubiquity of jeans among urban youth and intellectuals. When Solidarity leader Lech Wałęsa met with Pope John Paul II in 1983, Polish state television carefully framed shots to avoid showing the Union leader's American jeans, a detail not lost on sharp-eyed Polish viewers. In Yugoslavia, which maintained more open borders and trade relations with the West than other communist states, jeans became widely available earlier. By the late 1970s, the port city of Trieste, just across the Italian border, had become a shopping destination for Yugoslavs seeking Western goods. Stores near the border specialized in serving Yugoslav customers, with jeans being among the most sought-after items. The most poignant stories of denim desire came from East Germany, where citizens could watch West German television but couldn't cross the Berlin Wall to shop for the products they saw advertised. East German authorities were particularly concerned about Western influence on youth, going so far as to create special police units targeting teenagers wearing Western fashion. Yet by 1978, even Walter Ulbricht, the hardline East German leader, had to acknowledge reality, grudgingly allowing the production of authentic-looking jeans within East Germany. What made the jean phenomenon especially powerful was how it crossed social boundaries. While other Western cultural influences like rock music or avant-garde art primarily affected urban youth and intellectuals, the desire for good denim transcended age, class, and geography. Factory workers saved for months to buy jeans on the black market. Rural farmers traded agricultural products for denim. Communist Party officials and their children sought out the forbidden blue gold, often exploiting their privileged positions to obtain it. This universal appeal made jeans particularly threatening to communist ideologues. When both party officials and dissidents coveted the same Western product, the moral authority of the system was fundamentally undermined. As Hungarian economist János Kornai observed in his studies of shortage economies, the failure to satisfy consumer desires created a daily referendum on the system's legitimacy, a referendum the system was losing. By 1980, the symbolic battle over jeans had reached a crucial phase. Soviet authorities, recognizing they couldn't stem the tide of denim desire, began shifting their strategy. Rather than fighting Western cultural influence directly, they attempted to channel it into acceptable forms. Youth fashion shows in Moscow began to feature denim, albeit with commentary emphasizing the practical worker origins of jeans rather than their Western cultural associations. The official Soviet stance remained ambivalent. In a 1980 speech to Komsomol youth leaders, Soviet ideological chief Mikhail Suslov warned about harmful Western influences on Soviet youth culture, while acknowledging that certain international fashion trends could be adapted to socialist reality. This tortured phrasing reflected the impossible position of authorities trying to maintain ideological purity while addressing real consumer desires. Throughout the Eastern Bloc, the early 1980s saw increasing official tolerance of jeans, coinciding with broader economic challenges facing communist regimes. As Poland plunged into economic crisis, Romania instituted harsh austerity measures, and even the Soviet economy stagnated under Brezhnev. The ability of these states to satisfy consumer needs diminished further. Western jeans, always desirable, now also highlighted by contrast, the growing economic failures of the communist system. What makes this story particularly compelling is how ordinary people, not politicians or generals, drove this form of Cold War contest. Every teenager who saved for months to buy Levi's, every tourist who sold their jeans for an astronomical sum, every black marketeer who risked punishment to supply Western goods, all were participants in a vast, uncoordinated, but powerful expression of consumer desire that communist systems ultimately couldn't contain. The great irony is that blue jeans had originally been working-class attire invented for miners and cowboys, exactly the sort of practical proletarian clothing that should have been celebrated in communist ideology. Instead, The Soviet system's inability to produce desirable consumer goods transformed this working-class garment into a symbol of Western excess and desirability. Levi Strauss & Company itself maintained a complex relationship with its unexpected role in Cold War cultural politics. While recognizing the marketing potential of being a coveted symbol of Western freedom, the company also faced practical and ethical questions about how to engage with Eastern markets where its products were in such demand, but official barriers remained high. Former Levi's executive Alfred Sanguinetti recalled the company's dilemma. "We knew our jeans were selling for crazy prices on black markets in Warsaw and Moscow. People were literally trading family heirlooms for them. But we couldn't officially distribute in most of these countries because of trade restrictions and currency problems." It was a strange situation, being incredibly popular in places where we couldn't even do business. This changed gradually through the late 1970s and early 1980s as Levi's negotiated limited distribution agreements, first with Hungary and Yugoslavia, then with Poland, and finally with the Soviet Union itself. These agreements typically involved complex barter arrangements rather than straightforward sales, reflecting the currency restrictions and economic isolation of the Eastern Bloc. For many Eastern Europeans who lived through this period, the memory of their first pair of real jeans remains vivid decades later. Czech writer Milan Kundera captured this emotional resonance in his novel The Unbearable Lightness of Being, where a character's Western jeans become a treasured possession symbolizing connection to a different, freer world. Similar testimonies abound in oral histories of the period. Irina Bulgakova, who grew up in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, during the 1970s, recalled, "My father traveled to Finland for work in 1977 and brought back Levi's for me. I was 16. I slept with them under my pillow the first night. At school, people asked to touch them. A boy I had a crush on finally noticed me. It sounds silly now, but those jeans changed how I saw myself and how others saw me. They were magical." The intensity of desire for Western jeans created situations that seem almost farcical in retrospect. There were reports of people in the Soviet Union wearing jeans to their own weddings. East German border guards were known to confiscate particularly desirable jeans from travelers, officially classifying them as items of speculation, but often keeping them for personal use or resale. In Czechoslovakia, following the 1968 Soviet invasion that crushed the Prague Spring, wearing Western jeans became a subtle form of protest, visible enough to signal opposition to the regime, but not explicit enough to trigger immediate repression. Czech dissident Václav Havel noted in his essays how such small acts of cultural independence helped maintain the parallel polis, the alternative civil society that existed alongside official structures. As the 1980s progressed and Soviet control began to weaken, the jean phenomenon evolved. With Mikhail Gorbachev's ascension to power in 1985 and the implementation of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, restrictions on Western goods gradually eased. Official Soviet media began acknowledging the quality gap between domestic products and Western imports. A 1987 article in Pravda remarkably admitted, "Why are our citizens willing to pay 10 times the price for foreign-made jeans? Because the quality difference is obvious to anyone who has eyes to see." This period also saw the expansion of joint ventures and licensed production. In 1987, Levi Strauss formed a partnership with a Hungarian textile firm to produce authentic Levi's within the Eastern Bloc for the first time. Similar arrangements followed in other countries. These developments marked a significant shift from smuggling and black markets to increasingly official channels for Western consumer goods. Yet even as official barriers lowered, the mystique of Western jeans remained. Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski observed in 1988, "Now that it's becoming possible to buy Western products through normal channels, you might expect the obsession would fade, but the opposite is happening. People want these symbols of the West more than ever, because they represent what's still missing here. Not just consumer choice, but the whole different way of life that comes with it. Indeed, as the final years of the Cold War approached, jeans had become about much more than clothing. They represented a referendum on competing systems. Every pair of Levi's, worn on the streets of Warsaw, Prague, or Moscow, made a statement about which world, East or West, was delivering what people actually wanted. The symbolic power of jeans reached its zenith in the pivotal years of 1989-1991, when the Iron Curtain finally parted and the Soviet system collapsed. As the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, among the first East Germans crossing to the West, many were wearing their prized Western jeans, simultaneously a celebration of newfound freedom and a symbol of what they had desired for so long. The opening of borders brought a flood of Western consumer goods eastward, with jeans leading the way. In the months following the fall of the Berlin Wall, temporary markets sprang up near border crossings where Western merchants sold denim to eager Eastern customers. In Poland, the famous Stadium Market in Warsaw became a massive bazaar for Western goods, with entire sections devoted to different jean brands. As restrictions lifted, Western retailers rushed to establish themselves in former Eastern Bloc countries. When Levi's opened its first official store in central Prague in 1990, the line of customers stretched for blocks. Similar scenes played out in Warsaw, Budapest, and eventually Moscow. The symbolic significance wasn't lost on observers. These stores represented not just new retail opportunities, but the triumph of a certain vision of society. For the generation that had smuggled, traded, and saved for authentic Western jeans, these developments represented a vindication of sorts. Their consumer desires, once denounced as bourgeois materialism, were now acknowledged as legitimate. The systems that had tried to dictate not only political thought but also personal appearance had failed. Yet the post-communist transition also brought complications to the jeans narrative. As Western brands became readily available, the mystique surrounding them inevitably diminished. The very scarcity that had made jeans so precious during the Cold War disappeared. At the same time, economic hardship during the transition meant many people in former communist countries couldn't afford the Western goods they had long desired, even when they were finally available. This created a paradoxical situation where the symbols of Western prosperity were now physically present, but economically inaccessible to many, a different kind of frustration than the previous era's enforced scarcity. As one Polish commentator noted wryly in 1992, for 40 years we couldn't get jeans because of politics. Now we can't get them because of economics. Some would say this is progress. The 1990s also saw a surge in counterfeit Western goods throughout the former Eastern Bloc. Without the sophisticated authentication systems of the old black market days, many consumers fell victim to increasingly convincing fakes. Markets in major Eastern European cities were flooded with counterfeit Levi's, often manufactured in Turkey or China, creating a new chapter in the region's complicated relationship with authentic Western brands. As the initial euphoria of liberation faded, attitudes toward Western consumer goods, including jeans, became more complex. Some embraced Western brands unreservedly as symbols of the new era. Others felt nostalgia for the days when such items were rare treasures rather than common commodities. Still others rejected Western consumerism entirely, seeing it as a new form of cultural imperialism, replacing Soviet domination. This ambivalence was captured by Czech writer Ivan Klima, who observed in 1995, during communism, Western jeans were magical objects that seemed to contain the essence of freedom. Now that we have political freedom, we discover that jeans are just pants after all. Good pants, yes, but still just clothing. Perhaps this disappointment is a necessary part of growing up as a society. Indeed, by the late 1990s, the special status of jeans in Eastern Europe had largely normalized. The generation coming of age after communism's fall viewed denim as just another consumer choice rather than a powerful symbol. The extraordinary black market values, the elaborate smuggling operations, the jean-based economy all became stories told by parents and grandparents, often to the disbelief of younger listeners. Yet for historians and cultural analysts, the blue jean phenomenon remains a fascinating lens through which to understand how the Cold War was experienced at the everyday level. It demonstrates how ordinary consumer desires could take on profound political significance in a divided world. The jean phenomenon reveals that, alongside the military standoff and ideological battles, the Cold War was also fought through blue denim, one pair at a time. The story continued to evolve in unexpected ways even after the Cold War ended. By the early 2000s, many of the former Eastern Bloc countries had joined the European Union and integrated into global markets. Levi Strauss and other Western companies that had once been smuggled behind the Iron Curtain now operated normal supply chains throughout the region. Shopping malls in Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest featured the same international brands found in Paris or London. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened in Western markets. Vintage Soviet-era goods became fashionable. The same Eastern Bloc jeans that had been rejected as inferior by their own citizens during the Cold War, brands like Rifle from Czechoslovakia or Kometa from East Germany, became collector's items among vintage fashion enthusiasts in Western Europe and North America. Online marketplaces featured these once derided products commanding premium prices as Soviet vintage or communist chic. This ironic reversal was not lost on those who had lived through the original jeans phenomenon. As Hungarian fashion historian Katalin Medvedev noted, the very Soviet jeans that nobody wanted in 1980 are now selling to Western collectors for more than original Levi's. History has a sense of humor after all. For the major Western jean manufacturers, the opening of Eastern markets represented both opportunity and challenge. The pent-up demand for authentic brands created an initial boom, but this was followed by increased competition and the need to adapt to local economic conditions. Levi Strauss, which had once commanded black market prices 10 times its retail value, found itself competing with both local manufacturers and global fast fashion brands in the new market environment. The company's internal documents from this transition period reveal the strategic importance placed on Eastern European markets. A 1992 Levi's marketing plan stated, "These markets represent not just new sales territories, but validation of what our brand has symbolized for decades." The challenge is transitioning from forbidden fruit to everyday preferred choice without losing the special status we've historically enjoyed. This transition wasn't always smooth. Western brands like Levi's discovered that the mystique that had surrounded their products during the Cold War couldn't be maintained in an open market. Many consumers, once they had satisfied their initial desire for authentic Western jeans, became more price-sensitive and willing to consider alternatives. Others, having achieved the long-desired status symbol, moved on to new aspirational brands. Levi Strauss responded with targeted marketing campaigns that acknowledged the brand's unique history in the region. A 1995 advertising campaign in Hungary featured the tagline, "Finally Yours," alongside images contrasting the old black market days with new official availability. In the Czech Republic, a billboard campaign showed a pair of jeans behind glass with the words, "No longer a museum piece." These marketing efforts recognized the powerful place jeans had occupied in the collective imagination of Eastern Europe. They attempted to leverage nostalgia for the forbidden status of Western jeans while positioning the brand for a normalized consumer environment. The results were mixed. While Levi's and other Western brands established successful retail operations throughout the former Eastern Bloc, they never again commanded the extraordinary premium or cultural significance they had during the Cold War years. For the generation that had come of age during the height of the jeans phenomenon, the normalization of what had once been precious created complex emotions. Many spoke of feeling both satisfaction that the objects of desire were finally freely available, and nostalgia for the days when possessing such items required ingenuity and carried special meaning. This sentiment was captured beautifully by Polish filmmaker Krzysztof Kieślowski, who in a 1994 interview reflected, "Under communism, getting Western jeans was an adventure, a statement, almost a spiritual quest. You saved, you searched, you connected with underground networks. When you finally got them, you felt you'd achieved something significant. Now you just go to a shop and buy them. It's better, of course, more rational, more fair, but something of the magic is gone." This nostalgia wasn't for communism itself, but for the intensity of desire and meaning that scarcity had created. It reflected a broader phenomenon that scholars have identified in post-communist societies, a complex relationship with consumer culture that includes both embrace of new freedoms and ambivalence about the values of market-driven societies. By the early 21st century, the former Eastern Bloc had fully integrated into global fashion markets. Shopping malls in Warsaw featured the same mix of international brands as those in Western capitals. Young people in Prague or Budapest dressed indistinguishably from their counterparts in Paris or Berlin. The visible East-West divide in consumer culture had largely disappeared. Yet cultural memory of the jeans phenomenon persisted. Museums in former Eastern Bloc countries began featuring exhibitions on Cold War consumer culture, with Western jeans displayed as artifacts of historical significance. The Museum of Communism in Prague includes a section dedicated to black market goods with Levi's jeans prominently featured. Similarly, the DDR Museum in Berlin showcases the contrast between Western denim and Eastern alternatives as part of telling the story of divided Germany. Academic interest in the cultural significance of Western goods during the Cold War also grew. Historians, anthropologists, and cultural studies scholars began examining black market consumer goods as important elements in understanding how ordinary people experienced the Cold War. The jeans phenomenon became a case study in how consumer desires could undermine political systems. This scholarly attention validated what participants had always known, that the quest for Western jeans had been about much more than fashion. It had been about identity, resistance, status, and ultimately a referendum on competing systems. The blue denim revolution may not have been the only factor in the collapse of communism, but it was a tangible manifestation of the system's failure to satisfy basic consumer desires. For Levi Strauss & Company, this historical role became part of corporate lore. Company archives preserved letters, photographs, and testimonials from Eastern Europeans describing what the brand had meant during the Cold War years. In 2009, Levi's launched a limited Behind the Iron Curtain collection that referenced this history, with designs inspired by the modifications Eastern Europeans had made to their precious jeans during the communist era. As one Levi's executive reflected, "Few brands can say they played a role in a geopolitical struggle. We didn't set out to be symbols of Western freedom, but that's what happened." People behind the Iron Curtain invested our products with meaning far beyond what we could have imagined when we were just trying to make good, durable pants. Indeed, the power of Western brands as freedom symbols was neither planned nor coordinated. It emerged organically from the interaction between consumer desires and political restrictions. This makes the jeans phenomenon a particularly pure example of cultural soft power. Influence that flows not from government policy, but from the genuine appeal of a society's products and values. Political scientist Joseph Nye, who developed the concept of soft power, has cited the blue jeans phenomenon as a classic example of his theory in action. When people desire your products not just for their functional value, but for what they represent, that's soft power at work. No government program could have created the mystique that surrounded American jeans in Eastern Europe. It arose spontaneously and was all the more powerful for that reason. This spontaneous nature distinguished cultural influence from propaganda. Soviet citizens were well trained to recognize and dismiss official Western propaganda. But their desire for Western genes came from personal experience and peer validation, making it much harder for authorities to counteract. As Russian cultural historian Alexei Yurchak has noted, Soviet youth could recite anti-Western talking points perfectly while simultaneously coveting Levi's jeans without seeing any contradiction. The first was public performance. The second was authentic desire. By the 2010s, enough time had passed that the jeans phenomenon began to be treated as proper history rather than recent memory. Documentary films like Comrade Denim, 2012, and books such as Blue Jeans in the Red House, Consumerism on the Other Side of the Iron Curtain, 2015, chronicled the extraordinary role of Western fashion in Cold War cultural politics for audiences too young to remember it firsthand. These historical treatments emphasized not just the political dimensions, but the human stories. The young people who had saved for months to buy a single pair of jeans, the elaborate networks of traders and smugglers, the ingenious methods of authentication, the intense emotions associated with finally obtaining the coveted blue gold. Oral history projects in several former Eastern Bloc countries collected testimonials about Western goods during communism, with jeans featuring prominently in these accounts. The European Memory and Solidarity Network's Objects of Memory project gathered hundreds of stories about treasured Western items, revealing the deep personal significance these consumer goods had held. One particularly moving account came from Maria Kovacs, who grew up in 1970s Hungary. My brother escaped during the 1956 uprising and settled in America. For 15 years, we couldn't communicate at all. Then, in the 1970s, relations improved slightly, and he was allowed to send us a package. He included a pair of Levi's for me. I was 17 then. Those jeans weren't just clothing, they were my connection to my brother, to a world I couldn't visit, to possibilities I couldn't imagine. I still have them, folded in tissue paper. My daughter says I'm silly to keep old pants, but to me, they're the most precious thing I own. Stories like Maria's illustrate how Western consumer goods could become vehicles for emotional connection and personal meaning beyond their material value. In a system that restricted free movement and communication, objects could serve as proxies for human relationships and unreachable experiences. This emotional dimension helps explain why the jeans phenomenon went far beyond rational consumer preference. Eastern European consumers weren't simply making calculated judgments about product quality, though Western jeans were indeed superior to domestic alternatives. They were also engaging in a form of emotional and ideological alignment through their consumer choices. As we examine this history from today's perspective, several broader patterns emerge. The jeans phenomenon demonstrates how supposedly impermeable borders remain porous to cultural influence. Despite elaborate restrictions on trade and travel, despite jamming of Western broadcasts and censorship of Western media, despite ideological campaigns against Western materialism, blue jeans still found their way behind the Iron Curtain, both physically and as objects of desire. This porousness was not accidental, but structural. The very officials tasked with enforcing restrictions were often complicit in circumventing them. Diplomats, party officials, and their children were frequent customers on the black market, using their privileged positions to obtain coveted Western goods. This elite hypocrisy, publicly denouncing Western materialism while privately pursuing it, contributed to the system's moral bankruptcy in the eyes of ordinary citizens. The jeans phenomenon also reveals how consumer culture served as a form of everyday resistance. While only a small minority of Eastern Bloc citizens engaged in formal political dissidence, millions participated in the informal economy of Western goods. Each transaction represented a small vote against the system's ability to dictate consumer choices. Collectively, these individual acts of consumer preference constituted what political scientist James Scott calls weapons of the weak, forms of resistance available to those without formal political power. Furthermore, the blue jeans story demonstrates how cultural symbols can take on meanings far beyond their original context. Levi's jeans, designed as practical workwear for American laborers, became potent symbols of freedom, rebellion, and Western prosperity when transplanted to the Eastern Bloc context. This transformation of meaning occurred without any coordinated effort by Western governments or corporations. It emerged organically through the dynamics of restriction and desire. The lessons of this historical episode remain relevant today. As contemporary authoritarian regimes attempt to control information flows and cultural influences through internet restrictions, media censorship, and import controls, they face the same fundamental challenge that communist regimes encountered with blue jeans. Genuine desire cannot be legislated away. Cultural influence continues to seep across even the most closely guarded borders, carried by technologies, travelers, and the universal human appetite for choice. As Russian-American journalist Julia Ioffe observed, the current Chinese and Russian governments have learned from Soviet mistakes. They now allow consumer choice while restricting political freedom. But the fundamental tension remains. Once people taste choice in one domain, they often begin to expect it in others. When the final accounting of the Cold War is made, military standoffs and diplomatic negotiations will rightfully feature prominently. But alongside these official histories should stand the story of how ordinary people voted with their pockets and their wardrobes, choosing Western jeans not just as fashion items, but as declarations of where their aspirations lay. In the end, the blue jeans phenomenon was about much more than pants. It was about systems that couldn't deliver what people wanted. It was about the power of visible symbols in a world divided by ideology. It was about how everyday choices can collectively undermine even the most imposing political structures. And perhaps most poignantly, it was about how something as simple as a pair of pants could come to represent freedom itself. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union faced an increasingly serious economic crisis. Oil prices, which had buoyed the Soviet economy during the 1970s, began to fall. Agricultural production stagnated. The technological gap with the West widened. In this context, consumer shortages worsened, making Western goods even more desirable, and the state's failure to provide for its citizens more glaring. Leonid Brezhnev's death in 1982 and the brief transitional leaderships of Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko did little to address these fundamental problems. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he inherited a system in deep crisis, economically, politically, and morally. His twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, attempted to revitalize Soviet socialism, but instead accelerated its collapse. In this late Soviet context, attitudes toward Western consumer goods began to shift at the official level. The old prohibitionist approach was increasingly recognized as counterproductive. Soviet economic planners began to acknowledge publicly what had long been obvious, that domestic consumer goods couldn't match Western quality and desirability. A 1986 internal memo from the Soviet Ministry of Light Industry, later published during Glasnost, admitted, "Our attempts to produce satisfactory domestic substitutes for Western jeans have largely failed. Despite 30 years of effort, we have not created products that our citizens consider equivalent." This represents not just a production failure, but a significant ideological challenge. This official acknowledgement marked a profound shift. For decades, Soviet authorities had claimed that socialist production would eventually surpass capitalist alternatives, satisfying consumer needs more efficiently and equitably. The admission that they couldn't even successfully produce desirable jeans, a relatively simple consumer product, undermined this fundamental ideological claim. Gorbachev's reforms accelerated the changes in official approaches to Western consumer goods. Import restrictions eased, joint ventures with Western companies were encouraged, and cooperatives, small private businesses, were permitted to manufacture and sell consumer products, including clothing. These changes were designed to revitalize the Soviet economy, but they also effectively conceded the consumer competition with the West. Ironically, as official restrictions on Western goods relaxed, some of the mystique surrounding them began to fade. When American jeans became more readily available through official channels, even at high prices, they began to normalize from forbidden symbols to merely desirable products. Yet the damage to the system's legitimacy had already been done. The decades of consumer frustration had contributed to a profound cynicism about official claims and promises. This cynicism permeated late Soviet society, as Russian writer Viktor Pelevin later captured in his novel Generation P, set during the Soviet collapse. Nobody believed in anything anymore, not in communism, which had failed to deliver its promises, not in capitalism, which seemed to offer bright packaging, but no certainty. The only thing people believed in was the superiority of Levi's over any Soviet jeans. This was an established fact, like gravity. As the final years of the 1980s brought increasing openness and economic experimentation, the first legitimate Western brands began establishing official presences in the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In 1988, Pepsi-Cola opened its first restaurant in Moscow. Long lines formed, not unlike the queues for scarce goods in regular Soviet stores, but this time, people waited eagerly for a taste of the West, rather than necessities. The next year, 1989, brought the revolutions that would ultimately end Soviet control of Eastern Europe. First Poland, then Hungary, then East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. One by one, the communist regimes fell. The Berlin Wall, the most powerful physical symbol of the divided world, came down in November 1989. As jubilant East Germans streamed through the newly opened borders, Western journalists noted how many were wearing their prized jeans. The pants had become part of the visual iconography of liberation. The Soviet Union itself lasted 2 more years, finally dissolving in December 1991. During these final years, as restrictions disappeared and borders opened, Western consumer goods flooded in. What had once required elaborate smuggling networks now arrived in shipping containers. What had once cost black market prices now sold at normal retail, though still expensive by local standards. Western brands rushed to establish official presences in the newly opening markets. When McDonald's opened its first Moscow restaurant in January 1990, 30,000 people waited in line on the first day. Similar scenes played out as other iconic Western brands arrived. These were not just business expansions, but symbolic moments. The physical manifestation of Western consumer culture arriving in territories where it had long been desired but officially rejected. For jeans brands, these market openings represented a complex opportunity. The mystique that had surrounded Western denim during the Soviet era couldn't be maintained in an open market environment. Companies like Levi Strauss had to transition from being smuggled symbols of freedom to normal commercial products competing on price, quality, and marketing. This transition wasn't always smooth. Many Eastern Europeans, facing economic hardship during the post-communist transition, couldn't afford the authentic Western brands they had long desired, even when they finally became legally available. This created a market for counterfeits, which flooded Eastern European markets in the early 1990s. Ironically, many consumers who had become experts at spotting fake Levi's during the Soviet era now knowingly purchased counterfeits because authentic ones were beyond their means. For those who had participated in the jeans subculture of the Soviet era, the smugglers, the black marketeers, the authentication experts, the lucky owners of genuine Western denim, the post-communist normalization of jeans created mixed emotions. There was satisfaction that the objects of desire were finally freely available, but also nostalgia for the days when jeans had carried such powerful symbolic meaning. This nostalgia wasn't for communism itself, but for the intensity of desire and meaning that scarcity had created. It reflected a broader phenomenon that scholars have identified in post-communist societies, a complex relationship with consumer culture that includes both embrace of new freedoms and ambivalence about the values of market-driven societies. Romanian writer Andrei Codrescu captured this ambivalence in his essays on returning to Eastern Europe after the revolutions. Everyone wanted Western goods when they couldn't have them. Now that they can have them, at least theoretically, the relationship is more complicated. There is disappointment that mere objects cannot deliver the happiness they seem to promise from a distance. As the former Eastern Bloc integrated into global markets through the 1990s and 2000s, the visible East-West divide in consumer culture gradually disappeared. Shopping malls in Warsaw or Prague featured the same mix of international brands as those in Western capitals. Young people throughout the former Soviet sphere dressed indistinguishably from their counterparts in Paris or London. The blue jeans that had once been precious symbols became everyday attire, yet the cultural memory of what jeans had once represented remained strong. Museums in former Eastern Bloc countries began featuring exhibitions on Cold War consumer culture, with Western jeans displayed as artifacts of historical significance. The Museum of Communism in Prague includes a section dedicated to black market goods, with Levi's jeans prominently featured. Similarly, the DDR Museum in Berlin showcases the contrast between Western denim and Eastern alternatives as part of telling the story of divided Germany. Oral history projects in several former Eastern Bloc countries collected testimonials about Western goods during communism, with jeans featuring prominently in these accounts. These projects revealed the deep personal significance these consumer goods had held, not just as fashion items, but as connections to an imagined West, as status symbols, as small declarations of independence from the system. For Levi Strauss & Company and other Western brands, this historical role became part of corporate lore. Company archives preserved letters, photographs, and testimonials from Eastern Europeans describing what the brand had meant during the Cold War years. This history was occasionally referenced in marketing campaigns targeting Eastern European consumers, though with mixed results. Younger generations often found these historical references puzzling or irrelevant. The story of blue jeans behind the Iron Curtain offers several enduring lessons about the relationship between politics, culture, and consumer desire. First, it demonstrates the limits of ideological control over personal preferences. Despite decades of propaganda promoting socialist values and denouncing Western materialism, millions of Eastern Bloc citizens still desperately wanted Levi's. Second, it illustrates how objects can become invested with political meaning far beyond their practical function. In the context of Cold War Europe, jeans weren't just pants, they were statements about which world offered a more desirable way of life. Every pair of Levi's visible on the streets of Warsaw or Prague tacitly challenged the legitimacy of the system. Third, the jeans phenomenon reveals the power of visible symbols in ideological competition. Unlike other Western goods that could be consumed privately, jeans were worn publicly, creating a visual testament to Western influence that could be seen by anyone walking city streets. This visibility made jeans particularly powerful as instruments of cultural influence. Fourth, this history highlights the role of everyday choices in large-scale historical change. While high-level politics and economics certainly drove the Cold War's outcome, the cumulative effect of millions of individual consumer preferences played a meaningful role in undermining the legitimacy of communist systems. Finally, the blue jeans story reminds us that history is not just made in presidential palaces and diplomatic conferences, it also unfolds in markets, bedrooms, and smugglers' suitcases. The grand narrative of the Cold War includes not just missiles and summits, but also the humble story of pants that became powerful symbols of a different possible world. Today, visitors to Moscow, Prague, or Warsaw would find it hard to imagine the time when a pair of Levi's could be worth a month's salary or require elaborate smuggling networks to obtain. The once precious blue gold is now just another consumer good in the global marketplace. Yet for those who lived through that era, jeans remain potent symbols of both desire and disappointment, of a time when pants could seem to contain the promise of freedom itself, and of the complex reality that followed when that freedom finally arrived.